Parker, campaign manager for Tommy Valentine for County Commissioner. We're here with Tommy.
Hi, I'm Tommy Valentine. I'm the candidate that gets managed by Mariah Parker.
And we're here in the 9th Commission District of Athens-Clarke County, and are excited to talk to you all about affordable housing and how we can create an affordable Athens. So Tommy, any thoughts before we begin?
Yeah, so first of all, if you're watching this, we encourage you to participate. This is a virtual town hall, which means it's not just about watching us talk. You're certainly welcome to watch along, but we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comment section below. So you can comment a story, maybe how housing in Athens has affected you. You can comment a question if you have a question, or maybe you have an idea on how we could do a better job here. We definitely want you to do that. The other thing that we want you to do is to keep in mind that this is a work in progress. Mariah, can you share with the viewers a little bit on how in this campaign historically we've developed our platform through community input?
So before launching the campaign last May, there was a series of community meetings hosted monthly where we'd invite people from all across Athens to come discuss issues of importance to them, and something we've kept up with ever since, and a very key part of the way that we built our platform and intend to when we govern.
Right. And because of that, we want to say that in the beginning as kind of a disclaimer. We are not experts in any one topic yet. We didn't, when we think about the platform that we started, we did so by listening to you. I'm not a career politician, neither is Mariah. We are not part of the political establishment, but we are hopefully good listeners. And we also do our research, and that's what this is about. So this isn't the final conversation we're going to have. This is the first conversation. And I guess as the last thing I'll say as an introductory remark, you're going to hear a lot of ideas, and the fact of the matter is with 300 nonprofits here in Athens and with a lot of excellent local government workers, it's possible that some of the initiatives that you might propose or we might propose might be currently underway. Our argument on that is that if, as politically involved as we are, we still don't know about those things, there's a high likelihood that a lot of the people in our community don't either. So if you do hear us suggest an idea that's currently underway or has been tried and hasn't worked, we also encourage you to let us know in the comments section. So with that said, we are watching in, so we're trying to see as you guys tune in. We also have our communications director, Ruth, off camera here. And Ruth, if you see any questions or anyone else popping in, we definitely would like to know. So yeah, those are our introductory remarks.
All right. Would you like to start off by giving folks a definition of affordable housing?
Sure. So when we talk about affordable housing, one of the first things to understand is the federal definition of affordable housing. So affordable housing means that you take your entire income, then you divide it into 12 chunks, so that you're looking at your month-to-month ratio, and then you're going to reduce the amount of taxes that are going to be withdrawn from your paycheck. That is your actual income, all right? That is going to be your actual net household income. Now, from that, what you're looking for is no more than 30% of your net take-home income to be spent on housing. Now, that doesn't just mean your rent. That means that 1/3 of your income should be covering your rent, your utilities, any housing insurance or renter's insurance that you have, and any taxes associated with your housing. Realistically, we run the numbers, and in Athens, since Athens has a median income of about $57,000, what that means is that affordable housing for a family of 4 or a family of 3 should look roughly at around $1,000. Now, while it's true that there is some housing at that level, we also have to start by just saying there's barely any of that. What makes it even more harmful is to look at people that are living under extreme home ownership duress. 40% of our population lives below the poverty line. When you do those numbers, let's assume that you're fortunate enough in this city to be making $12 an hour and taking home as a household around $24,000 a year. Under those numbers, you would need to find housing that approaches around $800. And frankly, there's just not that much housing in the Athens area that meets that qualification.
Yeah. I also want to say hi really quick to some people that are watching.
Yeah.
Ashley Marie Peterson, thanks for tuning in, and Kelly Dugan, thanks so much for your support. Tommy, could you give us a brief history on affordable housing as well while we're waiting for some questions?
So in this campaign, we talk a lot about history, and I know that occasionally there are criticisms out there that When we talk about the past, we're forgetting about the future. And I think that one of the agreements that we have here is that there's no way to talk about the future without acknowledging the past. Athens is particularly heinous when it comes to issues related to housing, especially when we talk about housing related to the African American population. So, some quick context. I like to cite my sources, so I will say that some books we encourage you to read. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein talks a lot about some of the issues that we're going to address here today. Our local Ms. Baradaran's book, The Color of Money, is also highly recommended, as is The New Suburban History. We also recommend that. But when we're talking about the history of housing in Athens, we have to talk about the history of housing nationally. So let's quickly have that conversation.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand that in Athens, right before the Civil War, that 50% of the population of Athens were enslaved. And even after emancipation, a lot of those families stayed. But prior to the Great Migration, even pre-Jim Crow, there were barriers in place that prevented African Americans from saving money, earning money, and of course from purchasing or having access to housing. Mm-hmm. That problem was only exacerbated when you think about the limitations towards black banking, limitations of African Americans using traditional white bank institutions, and also the failure of the Freedmen's Bureau, which eradicated black wealth around the United States. What you basically see is that time and time again, even prior to the Great Depression, even once the shackles were so-called removed from African Americans living in the South and in cities like Athens, that people were formally or informally segregated into different neighborhoods. They were denied access to fair wages. And so when you have the Great Depression decimated everybody. But for African Americans in this area who already didn't have much and had already lost a lot through things like the Freedmen's Bureau debacle, which we encourage you to look more up about, what you basically see is that black wealth of any kind, any chance that was eradicated during the Depression, and then nothing ever came along to help. Now, things did come along to help white folks, most notoriously the Federal Housing Authority. So what you see is that under the New Deal, people stepped forward that allowed white people to come back from the war, like my grandfather did, get a GI Bill, and then buy one of the increasingly high number of houses that were being created around the United States. Unfortunately, these houses were created with restrictive covenants. So the tradition was suburban houses, the kind of houses we think of as American homes, were created with restrictive covenants that denied African Americans the ability to purchase those homes within 25 years of those covenants being placed. Don't like that idea? Feel morally obliged to fight against it? Tough, because you couldn't get mortgage insurance, and therefore you couldn't get a mortgage without accepting those covenants in most neighborhoods. By some estimates, 80% of housing that was created in the aftermath of the Great Depression were placed under these types of restrictions. You can go right now to the Athens Clarke County Courthouse and look up deeds from the Athens area, including this neighborhood that I live in, Newtown, and find restrictive covenants throughout not only the 9th Commission District, but Athens at large. So the history of affordable housing includes shortages, low information, and discrimination. And so since we're going to have this discussion, one of the things that we really want to talk about is how we can increase the opportunity for everyone to have access to affordable housing regardless of race. And then also how we can increase the supply of affordable housing so that everyone, regardless of your racial background, whoever you are, whether you've been discriminated against in the past or not, whether you'll have access to purchase a home.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's check in really quick with some of our viewers who have posted some great questions. First, we have Kelly Dugan, who asked, what needs to change in Athens today to create affordable housing? Should we cap the cost of housing based on median income in the county, or do you have another approach in mind?
Yeah, so Kelly, thanks for the question. Rent stabilization or price fixing, rent fixing is an idea that we definitely need to explore. One thing to understand is that the state of Georgia passes a high number of laws that restrict local municipalities from governing itself in sufficient ways. Basically, it's called preemption law. And so some of these suggestions that we're going to talk about today, as a disclaimer in case we have any legal scholars out there, we're going to suggest things that the state doesn't want us to do in some cases. And that's okay, because as commissioner, part of my job will be going down to the state capitol and lobbying for fairer laws. But yes, Kelly, yes. To go back to your suggestion here, should we cap the cost of housing based on median income in the county? So, lots of cities around the country, and let's not pretend that Athens isn't growing. By some estimations, within about 15 years, we'll be a city of close to 300,000 people. In urban areas like the Athens area, cities around the country do rent stabilization as a form of ensuring that rent stays tied to median income. Now, I want to talk just a step further, Kelly, about median income. So yes, the median income of Athens is $57,000, but 40% of the city is impoverished. So that median income in this one case may not be the best number for us to start with. I think a lot of cities look at inclusionary zoning laws, and we'll talk about those in a moment. They look at laws that allow, if you're 50% below the median income, for you to have special help or to have rents available at that rate. One of the things we're going to talk about later in this conversation is we think that we need to go even farther than that. So basically, people that are far in the impoverished zones would have access to rent that's affordable to them. One last comment, Kelly, and I'll just say that we are going to have a conversation a little later in this video about inclusionary zoning when it comes to construction. We need laws in place and provisions in place that encourage and incentivize renters and developers to build units that are affordable for the majority of the population of Athens. We also need to make sure that any additional construction that takes place contains a certain number of units that can be afforded. That can also be done through incentives. It's not something that we've typically done in the history of Athens, but it's something that we certainly could do. What other questions do you want to get to, Mariah?
Well, I just want to remind everyone who's watching, first of all, thank you for being here. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please drop them in the comments. We'd love to address them. We actually have another story from one of our friends in the community, Sarah Bradley, saying that she may not be able to live here if she had to pay market price, but has enjoyed the privilege of having familial support and making that so. And that is the case for a challenge that I imagine many people in our community do face. And so we really appreciate you sharing that story.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks to Anna and Lydia, Sophia. Thank you to
Danny and Gabe and Boone for checking in. Hi, everyone.
So everybody that's checking in. So Sarah brings up a very important point, which is the relationship between privilege and access to capital and affordable housing. The truth is that if you look at the average home buyer in America under the age of 40, a lot of them are using bridge loans, legal or not, using bridge loans from family members. That means you find your home, you can't afford the full initial down payment. And rather than get a high interest loan or a loan you might not qualify for, you use the access to capital that comes from your family. So in Sarah's example, she said, the only reason I can afford my home is because my mom and stepdad own it and are allowing me to pay the mortgage. Those type of arrangements can only spring up in families and networks that already have some degree of home-based wealth. Unfortunately, in Athens, 40% of our population is poor, and those networks just don't exist. But Sarah, I'm really excited to see that. And I also see you made another comment here that you make sure that your kids know how privileged they are to have access to this, and you show them where they would live if they didn't have such help. And you're right, that's a very real way to explain privilege to them, and to explain that, look, in America we all like to feel like we work hard and we like to feel self-sufficient, but it's important to also acknowledge if you're born on second base, not to say that you had a double, all right? And I think that I really applaud you bringing this up, Sarah, because we need to include privilege in this discussion as well. If you're watching this, we encourage you to comment or like below. Your comments are coming in live, your questions are coming in live, and we're really enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, and feel free to share to invite more people into the conversation, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
So Tommy, how does the idea of affordable housing connect with our platform?
Yeah. By the way, Quentin Stevens, hello. So, as Mariah mentioned, starting in September of 2016, way back then, before November 2016, we started developing a platform through a series of community meetings. So some of you might have attended those meetings. We held them at Lake Park. And what we did is we opened ourselves up to the community. Hi, Wells, Jackson, Jason, hi.
Hi, all the way from Richmond, Virginia.
All right.
Yeah. Roanoke, Virginia.
Yeah, don't
Hi,
get
Wells.
that wrong. All right. So we developed a platform through community input. Through a series of meetings, we listened to you, tell us what you were afraid of, what you hoped for, what you wanted to see in the community, and we centered in on 5 different areas. Mariah, you want to share some of those areas?
Yeah, we centered in on making education more accessible for people, making transportation more accessible, economic development. We wanted to focus on criminal justice reform, and broadly focus on anti-poverty initiatives.
That's right. So these 5 areas encompass what eventually became our motto, which is opportunity and justice for all. And so if you go down these planks, these 5 planks, which we're going to do here, we can talk about how each of them relate to the discussion of housing. Today's not about us coming up with a brand new platform, but it is about addressing a pivotal need in our community, which is affordable housing. And I want to talk about how each of those 5 planks relates. So Mariah, why don't you take us through, tee me up, which one should we talk about first?
Let's start off talking about economic development.
Okay, economic development. So a lot of times in Athens, economic development as a term is used in a very restrictive way. We talk about increasing hospitality jobs, increasing hotels, which usually just creates an excessive number of low-wage jobs. We also talk about economic development when we actually mean is physical construction. So economic development might mean more skyscrapers. But what we really want to see is ground-level economic development. We want to see economic development that affects the African Americans in our community that have been locked out of the middle class. We want to see economic development that affects the poor across the country and across the county. And we want to see economic development that specifically addresses the needs of you, the viewer. So when we talk about that type of development, we have to talk about how we're going to create housing. Now, what's the link between housing and economic development? Well, if consumers can't afford to live near the shops that they would frequent, then they can't afford to buy things there. And so if you think about the downtown Athens area, if people that would otherwise walk to downtown and shop are priced out of that area, then there's no potential for commerce there, especially if we're seeing people buy up those homes that are then commuting to jobs elsewhere. From an economic development standpoint, we also have to talk about the effects of housing. Housing is often used as one of the first indicators of economic growth. And so we think housing is deeply tied to economic development for one last reason, which is that housing construction is a form of economic development. So if we as a city can take on affordable housing construction, which we can talk about in a minute, or if we can be part of public-private partnerships that build affordable housing, that's additional construction jobs locally. Potentially we can look at contracting towards minority-owned businesses, which also could be form of a targeted economic development. And so we see housing as being deeply embedded with economic development.
Absolutely. I wanted to quickly acknowledge Quentin Stevens, who's checked in. Hi, Quentin. Thank you so much for joining us. And he has a comment here about the role of credit and careers.
Yeah. So first of all, he said, "Hello, brother." Hello, brother. So careers around the Athens area, along with credit, play a huge role. I could not agree more. The fact of the matter is we will not be able to make any housing affordable until we deal with wages and access to good jobs. Anyone who lives in the Athens area knows that you've heard politicians brag about the number of jobs they've brought, Well, right now we have 40% poverty and 5% unemployment. Now, for those of you that are watching, yes, we acknowledge that the 5% unemployment number, any unemployment number, is not perfect because it leaves out people that have permanently given up hope and dropped off the workforce. But that same fact is true around the country. So if we use the 5% unemployment number that everyone's using, the same unemployment measure, let's just stick to it. 40% poverty, 5% unemployment. Think about that. Think about how many working families are still living in poverty. So without access to a positive career, a lucrative career, or at least a stable career, there's no chance for us to have the kind of housing market and housing stability that Athens desperately needs. Also, yes, credit plays a huge role. And having increased education, starting, we think, in elementary school on up, about basic good financial practices, and definitely having discussions about credit before people leave high school is critical. For the people that are already out of the K-12 system, we can't give up on them, and so I think we also have to have discussions about how to restore your credit. I think the city could be doing more to educate people about how to take control of their credit so they can become future homeowners. Thanks, Quentin. And if anyone else is watching, feel free to comment below.
Also, hi Kelly Reed, thanks for checking in. We appreciate you watching. Feel free to share this video. We're here live in District 9, and I'm here to answer your questions.
Oh, and hi Kathy Gumby.
Hi Kathy. So let's jump back over to the platform. We were talking about economic development. Let's say a few words on education. How does that relate to the issue of affordable housing?
Sure. So when we knock on doors, which we've been doing around the district, the first thing that you tend to say you care about is education. Now, let's draw a sharp distinction here. In Athens, Clarke County, we have the Mayor and Commission, and we have the Board of Education. These are two entirely different bodies, and it would be irresponsible for me as a candidate for commissioner to imply that I'll have control over local education policy. It would be great if I could say that. It's not fun to tell people at their door that I can't, but I've seen too many candidates in the Athens area growing up campaign on education when they know better. With that said, not all education is K through 12. And I think that there are a lot of ways that the Commission can influence what's going on in local education initiatives. Earlier this year, the City Manager's Office started a Citizens Government Academy, for example, that allowed the public to apply and actually complete a tour with information at each stop of different departments. That was an educational initiative that allowed people like me to get a better look behind the scenes of Athens government. So let's talk about those educational partnerships. Public-private partnerships, many people believe that public-private partnerships, in other words, partnerships between the government and private institutions, are the wave of governments in the future. We agree. And so what we would like to see is increased education. We can contract out, we can hold it in-house, but education around the community that informs more people how to purchase homes. Maybe we partner increasingly with the Land Trust. Maybe we do even more than we're already doing with Habitat. Non-profit private partnerships and non-profit private public partnerships are also possible. But we think that increasing education on how to purchase a home is really important. This last year, my wife and I went from renters. After 7 years of marriage, we finally were able to purchase our home. That's where we're broadcasting from today. And it was an extremely difficult, scary process that we barely made it through. And the fact of the matter is, if I didn't have access to people I could call and my family and friends and network that could explain to me how to jump over this hurdle or that hurdle, we never would have owned a home. And I think so many people in our community, they don't have anyone to call. In fact, if you live in a network, especially in communities that have had barriers placed up to prevent them from being homeowners, if you don't have access to that kind of institutional knowledge, then you tend to just give up and rely on renting when you could be building equity through homeownership.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Quentin jumped back in with another comment. Tom, you'd like to share?
Yeah, so Quentin, thank you again for sharing. So Quentin says, if I'm not mistaken, Athens is the highest rated government housing. Yes, education plays a huge role. I was a few years under you, but I also dropped out my senior year and quickly realized I needed to make a change. So first of all, Quentin, go Cedar Shoals. And let me just say that, yeah, so I don't think that despite the conditions of our environment, my experience, even though we had great teachers and administrators in high school, I don't think we had a true sense while we were at school of the conditions of the environment around us. Now, those of us that went home to different parts of Athens that exposed us to that reality, we woke up. But the vast majority of people came home. I know I was lucky enough to come home to a home where there was a warm meal on the table, safe place to study, and we just didn't realize how critical these issues were. So Yes, Quentin, education plays a huge role, and I think we need to start early and educate often. Yes, also, as far as government housing, I want to make sure that we give a lot of credit to people that are already working really hard. We have Housing and Community Development. Deborah Lonan, who is the executive director of that initiative, is doing incredible work. The Local Housing Authority also does incredible work, as does some of the nonprofits we've mentioned and specific partnerships like the Athens Land Trust and like Habitat for Humanity. So I think that it's great that we have high quality local housing. We just don't feel, and the numbers show, that it doesn't meet the demands of our community, and a lot of people don't qualify. So thanks.
So thanks, Quentin. Also, thank you to Zuhai Rivera and Brandon Rucker for checking in. Thank you all for watching.
Hi, guys.
We also have Gabriel Shippey with another question for us.
Yeah.
This one pertaining to renewable energy.
Hi, Gabe. So hi, Tommy and Mariah. I'd like to hear your plans on bringing Athens up to speed on renewable energy. So what I'm sure Gabriel knows is that the discussion on renewable energy doesn't have to be a different discussion from the discussion on housing. A little later in this program, we're going to talk about the idea of public land usage to create additional affordable housing units. If we do that, we have a responsibility to make sure that they're also sustainable. So that means that we need to look at consumption-based pricing on utilities. We need to make sure that we are using energy efficient models. There's also initiatives worldwide where when you make those additional units available, that you actually employ solar panels on the roof to power those units, to offset expenses for people living in those units, and to bring a city closer to an overall sustainable infrastructure. So yeah, as a Sierra Club member, I will tell you that I want to see Athens pledge and plan for 100% renewable energy in the future. We don't have to choose between that and having access to affordable housing. We can actually accomplish both at the same time. Yeah.
So thank you, Gabe. And thank you everyone watching. Thank you, Jake Merrick, for checking in.
Yeah.
Jake says, y'all keep up the good work. Good night. And we appreciate you so much for being here with us. Feel free to share the video with others if you want to join or have other people join in the conversation.
Yeah.
We'd like to continue we were talking a little bit about the points of our platform and how they sort of intersect with issues of affordable housing. Can we talk a little bit about criminal justice reform?
Sure. So some of you in high school may have read the book The Scarlet Letter. In that book, a woman who commits adultery or is accused of adultery has to wear an emblazoned scarlet letter A at all times. We believe that in our community, felons wear a scarlet F. Once you have a felony, you can actually be treated. In fact, another book we recommend is The New Jim Crow. It talks about that if you look at the way that African Americans were treated prior to the eradication or the supposed eradication of the Jim Crow era, once you have a felony in America, you go right back to that era. So if you have a felony, if you're a convicted felon, you can lose access to voting, you can lose access to jobs, you can be denied employment. In other words, you may have to work for substandard wages, but this also affects housing. It affects housing because you also can be denied access to housing. That's on top of the fact that there's increased initiatives among conservative forces to start increasing the boogeyman fear of drug use in public housing. Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is, the numbers show that impoverished people and people that don't have access to fair wages use drugs less. Surprise, surprise, drugs are very expensive. So the fact that people within public housing would use drugs more is just a myth. But what we're seeing is a push to see in public housing, like some of the ones in Athens, throughout Georgia, they've been actually doing a sustained push to try to do drug enforcement inside public housing. So as commissioner, that's one of the things that I would really want to make sure we fight against, and if necessary, that I go to the state capitol to fight against. The last thing I'll just say is we have to make sure that people that have had a history of a felony, that they're not denied housing. I'm not sure about you, but I'm pretty confident that it doesn't do us any good to take someone who has had that experience and deny them access to a job and a home. That seems to me the type of thing that would increase the difficulty of reentry into society and decrease the ability to put oneself in a position where they won't have to resort to criminal behavior. So I think that the last aspect of that is when we talk about the Scarlet F, we have to be honest about who's being pulled over more. We have to be honest about who's more likely to get those drug-related felonies, who's less likely to be able to defend themselves in court. And the answer consistently are African Americans. I think that we have a great local police chief. I think that we have an ambitious local police force that is quick to try to introduce reforms. I know that they're eager for additional training, and that's something that we need to talk about. And so I think that criminal justice reform will definitely play into our ability to reduce the number of local felons, and then also we can address funding for felony reentry.
Thank you very much, Tommy, and thank you everyone watching. Brianna Williams and Derek, thank you all for tuning in. If you all have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the comment section underneath the video. Share if you'd like to invite more people in the conversation. Yeah. And let's keep going through these platform pros, because as we're seeing, they do intersect with the issue of affordable housing often. So let's talk a little bit about transportation. How does that intersect with the issue of affordable housing?
Yeah, absolutely. So transportation is a big one, all right? The fact of the matter is that if you were to view an aerial map of Athens over time, you can see how affordable housing has increasingly been pushed farther and farther from the town center. A little history on that. So where's this book? All right, so this book here is called the Phelps-Stokes Fellowship Studies #1, The Negroes of Athens, Georgia. It's a book from the early 1900s, published by the University of Georgia in 1904, and it talks a lot about housing and African Americans in particular in the Athens area. If you were to compare the maps drawn in this book with the maps drawn today, what you'll see is that affordable housing has been pushed to the periphery as access to driving technology has increased. So in other words, the employers used to demand affordable housing close to downtown because they wanted people to be able to afford to walk to work. So if you owned a hotel in downtown Athens, it was important to have local people that were willing to accept lower wages that lived nearby. We're seeing that trend change, and so we're seeing affordable housing push off the loop, out to the perimeter, and so increasingly we see the need for affordable transportation, access to transportation, justice, and options. We think that transportation has a lot to do with affordable housing. For example, on the east side of Athens, it's possible to get a rental unit that in some cases is 50% of the price of a rental unit near downtown Athens itself. Unfortunately, transportation means that once you live on that side of town, you're basically locked out from a lot of the things you need. By increasing bike options, and not just bike options, bike is a luxury. I'm talking about biking as a way of life. By increasing safe, protected, divided bike lanes, we can actually make housing that is affordable across town accessible to all. So we definitely need to increase our bike infrastructure. The big thing that we're asking for in this campaign is for us to join the over 30 cities around the country that have fare-free transit. So Miami, Clemson, a lot of other places have taken this on, and it's doable. We know it's doable because that's what UGA does. Every student in UGA can get on and off the bus. So what we want to see is the creation of a universal access fee. In a universal access fee, you take all of the fares, you divide them equally, you divide them up among drivers, and every driver, when they go to pay their tag and title, pays a small nominal fee. In some cities, this fee is as little as $15 or $20, something exceptionally small. Once that fee is assessed, you can then turn around and see that everyone in the city would be able to just get on and off a bus with all, in some cases, just showing a local driver's license. It makes sense. And if you can take that $1.75 fee out of the equation for working people, you'll see that all of a sudden they can afford to use transportation and they can afford to actually live farther from town where the affordable units already are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tommy. Yeah. And thank you, Ashton Walker, who just tuned in. Thank you so much for watching. We got some more questions from our viewers at home. First from Brianna Williams. Do you have a hierarchical list of tasks that you would like to complete in order to make affordable housing a reality in Athens? Thank you, Brianna.
Thank you, Brianna. So, yes. Well, we have a hierarchical list of things that we know would work. I think that what we're going to have to do is take a fair look at how many of them are prevented by ALEC and preemption law. And we're going to also have to take a look at how many of them have willing partners in the community that are willing to fight for these rules, what type of support we'd have from other commissioners. I wish we lived in a situation where we could just do evidence-based practice and say, okay, what are the problems and how do we fix them? But that's not the situation we're in. There's political realities. So at the end of this program, in about 7 or 8 minutes, we're going to go through a list of potential solutions. I hope you'll stick with us, and we're going to talk about those and talk about the hierarchy of how effective we think those strategies would be.
All right.
Yeah, and Quentin, you said we're on the money. I appreciate you saying we're on the money.
I know Tommy won't read this because he's too humble, but Quentin also says you're a great candidate, and I support you 100%. So thank you very much, Quentin.
Yeah. And he also says, Mariah, my apologies for not acknowledging you.
That's all right. We appreciate you being here with us in spirit, and we hope you have a good evening. But let's get back into the last couple points. If you have any last questions, please don't hesitate to drop them in the comments section. We'd love to have you part of this conversation. So we talked a little about economic development, education, criminal justice reform, transportation. What about anti-poverty initiative? How does that relate broadly to the issue of affordable housing?
So, I don't know how much you're tapped in as a viewer to Athens history, but buckle in because this one's an important thing. Athens is Athens, Clarke County, as you know. We're a unified government. So if you're like me, I grew up not really understanding what that meant. What it means is that instead of a city or a county, we are a city-county together. And that didn't happen by accident. Those are unusual arrangements, and it happened in the early 90s. Now, it had to happen via public referendum, which means the public, you, had to vote for it. And there was a lot of pushback against that. If you go back and look at the reports, what you'll see is that African Americans in the more urban Athens city were concerned about the effects of the unified government, because what it would do is it would water down their vote. You would be bringing in rural, less diverse areas, and it would mean a loss of prestige, influence, and power. So to counter that, a provision was placed in the charter that guaranteed a Department of Human and Community Development, now Housing and Community Development, with, and this is the important part, adequate budget and status to look at the causes of local poverty, to address them and to remedy them. It's pretty bold. It promises adequate budget and status basically to address poverty. This isn't a promise we've kept. We've relied on federal pass-through funds, we've relied on state grants, and we have not dedicated any sense of priority. Let me put it to you this way. I want you to imagine for a moment that you as a viewer are sitting in the doctor's office, and the doctor sits you down and says, I have found out that 40% of your body is covered in cancer. 40% of your body has tumors running through your body. And while you're sitting there and taking the impact of that, you then hear him say, and that's why we're going to give you a nose job. It doesn't really make any sense, right? And I think, unfortunately, that's the attitude of public policy in Athens. We know we have 40% poverty. We know that we are not loving our neighbors and taking care of our neighbors. And yet we keep proposing these glamour projects. We keep proposing these things that make us feel better or make our lives 5% more inconvenient, 5% more convenient, while ignoring the 40% of people around us. And so I think that when it comes to the anti-poverty initiative, the key here is there will be no performance increase without quantification. We have to measure ourselves. So what I'm and what we are calling for is a dedicated initiative, anti-poverty initiative, with quarterly, semi-annual, and annual updates on the levels of poverty in our community. We want to see how we're doing. In fact, I would even propose that we see how we're doing commission district by commission district so that our commissioners are held to poverty ebbs and flows in their own community. We have commissioners, and I could name these commissioners by name, that refuse to go to certain neighborhoods because they say, quote, there's no votes there. So I think that bringing these commissioners in line and holding them accountable for poverty numbers in their district would be very effective. I'd also like to see that degree of measurement be applied on housing. So it would be great, wouldn't it be great to know, commissioner by commissioner, how housing is going in those areas, whether it's improving or not, especially when we look at a political establishment that tends to elect the same commissioners election after election after election. You know, we have local elected officials that have taken advantage of this system for decades and that earn a salary every year despite not seeing any improvement. I don't know a job in America where you can do a worse job or not do any improvement and keep your job for decades. But that's what we see in Athens. So I definitely think that we need to do more housing measurement, and I think that we need to quantify the number of houses we need to build and give access to decrease poverty. There's no way to eliminate our title as America's poorest college town without addressing housing as well.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to thank everyone watching. Alana Pierce, thank you for checking in. If anyone else has any last minute comments or questions, we welcome them. As well, I want to make a quick plug for our affordable housing roundtable discussion and potluck coming up on February 11th. If you want more information on that, stay plugged into our Facebook page. And we'll be checking the comments here if you have any comments or questions that come up after the town hall has ended today. So we want to keep this conversation going, and in doing so, let's jump into some solutions for affordable housing in Athens.
Sure. So thank you once again to everyone that's watching. If you would like to share this conversation on your wall, that will increase attention to this topic. It's a great way for you to help affordable housing. So you can just share this link, use the share link below. We'd love it if you make a personal comment on why this is an issue that's important to you. And also we'd love if you use the hashtag affordable Athens. That's the hashtag we're using for this initiative. So let's talk about some of the solutions that other communities have used to target affordable housing. And we're going to run through these fairly quick, but we look forward to discussing them in greater length at the potluck. And then we also look forward to having an in-person town hall that you will all be able to attend and take part in coming up. So one of the first things, and it's something that we've seen local groups fight against, are the limitations on single-family versus co-living arrangements. So a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of areas are preserving single-family limitations. Sounds good, right? We live in a town with 30,000 college kids, and a lot of people that own homes and want to protect that home value want to avoid basically impromptu fraternity and sorority houses bridging up overnight or loud college parties right next door. But in the process, what they're actually doing is they're preventing co-living, which is a common strategy that people that don't have access to affordable housing use to gain access to safe shelter. The more options that families who are in that situation have access to, the more tools in the toolbox, the better we can address this affordable housing crisis that we have in Athens. And so we want to see that. We want to see basically a decreasing number of areas that are under single-family limitations. Second thing, we want to talk about space efficiency. So I know there's been a push for little houses, or tiny houses as they're sometimes called. It's a controversial idea, and I don't think it's something where we should be using impoverished areas as the petri dish alone. I think that this is something we should be seeing around Athens. But if we can increase the number of units per area, that type of urbanization can allow lowered costs for affordable housing. We also live in an era where the current generation places a lower value on having large square footage. Having a safe place, a safe, energy efficient place to live would increase the number of affordable housing units as well. Another option we can do is a trust fund. This can be basically under the stewardship of the public, and it can be a trust fund that local developers and syndicates and private citizens and nonprofits can use to develop affordable housing areas. So basically, it's a fund that money can be poured into only for the building of affordable housing. We also have to talk about syndication itself. So syndication is a national trend. It's been going on since the 70s, and it's where businesses can enter into a market to build affordable housing units. It is a profitable but low yield institution, and it has been responsible for building hundreds of thousands of homes over the last few decades. One potential stumbling block on syndication is that it's been decreasing in effectiveness over time. A lot of this depends on low income tax credits, and what we're seeing is that as the decades go on, and housing units being created under that process. Another thing is the Civil Rights Committee. You want to explain to any of the viewers our discussions about civil rights committees?
One of the reasons I think Tom decided to run was taking part in the fight for comprehensive civil rights protections at City Hall in 2016.
Yeah.
And so that's also formed the basis of a lot of our thinking within the campaign about who needs to be served the most in our community and who we most need to look out for and protect.
Yep. So we tried as hard as we could to get this version of the commission to pass the Civil Rights Committee, a permanent municipal Civil Rights Committee, not a temporary task force, a permanent municipal Civil Rights Committee. Hundreds of cities have them. We presented the commission with all the information they needed to understand how successful they've been in other areas, even areas that are under the type of ALEC-created preemption laws as we are in this area. A Civil Rights Committee, just so you know, is something that has lots of different functions and suits the individual needs of a community, but they often include things like increasing communication between renters and property owners, ensuring that discriminatory practices aren't being followed, largely by sharing information. They can serve as an intermediary. So let's say you feel you've been discriminated against, they would be able to point you to people that might be able to offer you remedy. In Georgia, they're not allowed to have legislative functions, so they can't serve as a renter's court, which is some things that happen in other states. But we can fight against those preemption laws. We also can make sure that, I believe the Civil Rights Committee would prevent the type of race-based discrimination that a lot of local renters and people that are in the housing market complain about.
And that actually ties us into another comment we received from Thomas Hurd. Thomas, thank you very much for checking in. Thomas says, I was born and raised in Athens, but after undergrad and 2 graduate degrees, I had to leave to find the level of pay I was seeking. I found it extremely hard to break into leadership roles in the city. What are your thoughts on addressing barriers to minorities breaking into leadership positions across the employment spectrum in the city?
Yeah, Thomas, thank you so much for commenting. And I think that anyone like yourself that has spent some time, like you, I was raised in Athens, a lot of people find themselves having to leave Athens in order to find the kind of pay that they need to support their families. And you're right, it's also really hard to break into leadership roles here in the city, especially if you're African American or if you're somebody that isn't part of the currently empowered elite. So the question here is, what are your thoughts on addressing barriers to minorities breaking into leadership positions? So information is power, knowledge is power. We think a Civil Rights Committee that could make sure that we're sharing information on these obstacles so that frankly, in the same way that we see the hashtag #MeToo moment increasing awareness of sexual harassment and sexual abuse, we think that having more public dialogue about discrimination in our community is healthy. There are people in the community, some of these people used to be friends of mine and now won't return my calls, who are currently elected officials that think that this is a harmful discussion to have. We shouldn't talk about the kind of discrimination that prevents someone like Thomas from having access to leadership roles. But anyway, what's the Alcoholics Anonymous thing? The first step to solving a problem is admitting you have one. We think that there's a lot that we need to do. That's part of what this campaign's about, is having an honest assessment about discrimination. That discrimination is true whether we're talking about the leadership roles you were seeking, Thomas, or whether we're talking about people that are looking for affordable housing.
Yeah, so thank you so very much for contributing your comments. If anyone else has any now or even after the video ends, we'd be happy to answer your questions.
Yeah.
So please keep them coming. But Tommy, any last thoughts to add before we wrap up?
Well, I think we're going to keep it going. It seems like people are tapped in, and we still have a little ways to go.
Cool,
so
let's do it.
Yeah. So the next one I want to just go into is we've talked about the quantitative approach. So that means we need to measure housing demand versus housing supply, look at willingness to pay. We need to figure out, I think that, if we were able to present to developers, for example, that X number of people are willing to pay X dollars in a certain area, that's useful information. That kind of market analysis is something that the city could undertake that would be very useful. Next up, I want to talk about public land usage. This is a big one. Earlier, there was a question about hierarchy. This is, to us, top of the list of things we need to do. So Athens owns a lot of land. As you know, the University of Georgia owns a lot too, but increasingly when public land comes up, we're more than happy to sell it to the university, despite the fact that that then deprives our sales tax base and our property tax base, Public land usage is a strategy that places around the country, Virginia, Maryland, Illinois, New York, other places have really taken an aggressive approach on this. So in other words, we need to look at the land that Athens-Clarke County owns. We need to acquire land when possible. And we need to use that land to create affordable housing units. Think of it as a public option for public housing. We need to not only just create housing projects, we need to look at mixed income housing, We need to look at where we can build quality, attractive, affordable units. And we can do that by showing good stewardship over public land. Inclusionary zoning laws, we've talked about this. You know, I've had discussions with people around the state. There are plenty of cities that are poised to do this, and it's very simple. What we say is we set certain areas where if any increasing developments go into that place, there has to be a certain number of units that are affordable. Not affordable like, hey, they seem affordable, or like some kind of subjective measure, but affordable tied to the wealth of the city. In our case, it has to be tied to what would be affordable for people that are under the poverty line. So it's not just enough, we can start by looking at affordable for people at the median income. We don't even have enough of that yet. But if we really want to remedy the poverty situation in Athens, we also have to look at making things affordable for the impoverished. What are some of the other areas you want to target?
We talked a little bit about public-private partnerships previously. So could we move on to discuss perhaps reverse redlining? First of all, what is redlining for people who might not know?
Yeah, so if you're just tuning in to our discussion of affordable housing, we talked a little bit about redlining earlier when we talked about the effects of the New Deal. So everyone's heard this story and the myth that the New Deal got us out of the Depression, all right? And basically one of the ways it did that is that people that were soldiers or returning soldiers had access to a GI Bill, had access to money that they could suddenly use for housing. It was federal wealth creation. But to buy houses, there had to be a supply of houses. A lot of people are shocked by this, but the first public housing in America was all created for white people. There was housing shortages for white people. So we tend to think of public housing as being aimed at African Americans, despite that there's a greater number of people living in public housing today that are white than are black. But what redlining did was pretty sinister. It drew maps. There were about 239 urban area maps around the United States. And basically what it carved out is that if there was an area with a high concentration of African Americans, you couldn't get housing insurance there. And that was a horrific way of denying and preventing African Americans from moving into an area. This all happened during the Great Migration. So this happened as African Americans were leaving the South in record numbers. Jim Crow was in full effect. People were trying to find where to go. Every state wanted to prevent African Americans from moving there. And so they tried sector by sector to prevent African Americans from living in an area. It's called redlining because these maps, and these were federal maps, this was not an accident, this isn't a conspiracy theory, I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat. You can look this up, it's a documented fact. A lot of people are shocked to hear this, but redlining, what it actually did is there were red lines on areas that were high minority. And in those areas, you could not get housing insurance, which meant housing values in those areas plummeted, which was a further blow to any ability for African Americans to fairly enter the middle class. What reverse redlining would do would be to take a look at multi-generational housing, people that have been renting in certain areas for a very long time, or whose family have a history of, whose families have a history of living in a certain area. And basically, it's a way of looking at how we can preserve the right of those families to purchase homes in those areas. The Supreme Court has unfortunately banned public policies that benefit people specifically on the basis of race. So we would have to take care with the construction of these ordinances and these policies. But we could set up trust funds. We could set up public funding. We could actually purchase property. One option in reverse redlining is we could actually purchase property which we could selectively sell back. The city pays the down payment, we share any equity growth, and the individual that moves in pays the mortgage. So, you know, this would be taking a quantitative approach, looking at Athens, looking at how redlining affected Athens, and then going from there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
I also
David. Hey, David.
Yeah, I want to say hi to Daniel Bormans, who's also paying attention, tuned in, Don Chambers. If you all have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop a line in the comment section. We're here to have this conversation with you. And also, if you want to invite others to the conversation, please feel free to share this video. Yep. But yeah, we have a comment from David who says, there's numerous strategies to create affordable housing in Athens, but the limited resource available make it challenging. Yeah,
so if anyone knows, this is David. So David Augustania, hi David. I'll put it as a disclaimer, David has no connection to our campaign, and I know that David is an apolitical force in town, but David works with the Athens Land Trust, who does incredible work and trying to increase home ownership. And if any, since this is his day in and day out work, and we encourage everyone to look up the Athens Land Trust and the work they do. But yeah, David's absolutely right. There are very limited resources available. And that's where we have to go back to that city covenant. Enshrined in the law of our city that created the unification of our government, it states that there will be adequate budget and status for poverty eradication. And so to do that, we have to make sure that there's adequate budget and status for housing solutions. We can't solve poverty without addressing housing, so therefore we need adequate budget and status for those initiatives. David, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on some of these things, but some of that is we need to do a better job of looking at local grants. We need to fight for state money. We need to fight for federal money. So in other words, we need to bring in as much outside public money as possible. We also need to look at private institutions and private builders that might be willing to engage with us on creating affordable units. As a progressive, I don't want to slip too far into like purely neoliberal solutions. The market is not going to solve all our problems. However, I do think that we do need to look at investors and private sector solutions that might increase a number of units and funding when it comes to the creation of truly progressively affordable units. Yeah.
So thank you for your comment, David, and thank you for all that you do at Athens Land Trust as well. And if anyone else has any comments they want to share or questions, we're still here, we're still having this conversation, and we love your thoughts. Mm-hmm. So Tommy, talk to us a little bit. First, thank you, Kay Carroll, for tuning in. Also, Laura Valentine. I don't know if you have heard of her or know her. She's tuned in. Thank you, Laura, for watching. So we talked a little bit about reverse redlining as a solution for affordable housing in Athens. Talk to us a little bit about property tax freeze.
Okay, so this is not a new idea. In fact, one of the times that I know it's come up in the past is current Mayor Nancy Denson campaigned on issues related to property tax freezes. There's a number of ways you could do it. The idea is that the demands of the city, if you look at our city budget, an enormous portion of the revenue, city revenue that we depend on for city functions, comes from property taxes. That's complicated by the fact that every time we sell land to the university, that land is, I don't know if everyone here knows this or not, but the university doesn't pay property tax on any property it owns. So every time you see a new UGA building, that's a new tract of land that the university is exempt from paying property tax on. What this does is it shifts the burden to working families, and it means that people that actually are fortunate enough to be in a home, even if that home was affordable initially, it stops being affordable. And so one of the suggestions that have been out there, and Atlanta's been using this, and other cities are looking at it, is property tax freezes. Typically, cities that employ this method start with seniors. So people 65 years old and older who lack additional revenue, who every dollar they're ever going to earn is already in their bank account. We need to make sure we protect those people, and we need to make sure that they never want for any kind of shelter. And so having a property tax freeze for homeowners 65 years old and older is an attractive idea. The other thing we can do is we can look at property tax freezes in certain areas. If we were to tie property tax freezes to the areas that have been redlined, especially property tax freezes for homes that were owned over a certain number of years, then what we would effectively be doing is reverse redlining. We would be looking at people that had owned homes since a certain area or a certain time period in that area and protecting them from property tax increase.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And actually, we have another comment here from David who says, community land trust is one strategy and there are many more, but Georgia law kind of puts a damper on making them happen.
That's right. So yeah, a community land trust or community trust fund. Hi Vicki. Community land trust is certainly an idea that we need to employ. Yes, David, you're right. Georgia law, preemption law, again, prevents cities from governing themselves sufficiently. I know we're here to talk about affordable housing, but one of the most common questions I get is, what does the county commissioner do? And I guess if you're asking that question and you live in the city, that means you probably have never met your city or your county commissioner, and maybe it's not clear what exactly they are doing or should be doing. But we have local government people that work very hard. I'm very fond of a couple of our commissioners, but part of the role of commission, beyond just governing at City Hall, should be going to the Capitol and advocating for fair laws. we have let the state put too many limitations on our city. If you are a progressive, that should bother you because it prevents us from passing things that would affect local wages and pass progressive policy. If you're a conservative, that should also bother you because if you're a conservative, I'm sure you pledge this idea of small government is best government. Well, here in Athens, we aren't allowed to govern ourselves as small government. There's all these limitations placed in front of us. So even if there was something that progressives and conservatives alike agreed on, the state has stopped us from doing those things. I think that I'm laughing, by the way, because I'm thinking of the number of powerful people that I have on this video alone set out as part of the problem. I've mentioned the University of Georgia. I've mentioned some of the larger powers in play, including ALEC and preemption law. So all I'll just say is that I'm fully expecting tomorrow to come home and see some guy with a cigar in my living chair telling me what not to say anymore. He's going to break my thumbs. With that said, yes, Georgia law is unfair when it comes to solutions like community land trust. David, you're absolutely right. And we need our next commissioner of the 9th District to be someone that can go down to the Capitol and fight against those laws, fight for the eradication of those laws, and to fight against the creation of any further laws.
No doubt. And thank you to everyone. Thank you, David, for the awesome comments. Thanks, Josh Jones, for tuning in. If anyone else has any comments or questions that they'd like to share, drop us a line in the comment box. And let's keep it rolling. Let's talk a little bit about rent stabilization. What's your vision for that?
Sure.
In relation to affordable housing?
So this is a solution that's employed in cities around the country. If you tuned in earlier, you heard us talking a little bit about it. But the idea is that if you're a renter, you are more susceptible to the fluctuations in the market than almost anyone else, right? If you're already in a home and the market drops, you're in that home. It's already happening. But if you're in the market, or if you're a renter and the market drops, there's a recession, and prices can fluctuate dramatically, you are going to feel that more than anyone else. And so that is a market failure in many ways. And so I know some would argue it's not, that it's how the market operates, but there are many that would also argue that is a market failure. And so when the market fails, government has to step in. That's the role of government. And so rent stabilization is a way to do that. Some people call it rent fixing. There's lots of names for it, but the idea is to set requirements and put ordinances in place that would affect how quickly and how rapidly rent could increase in any one area. For those of you that are watching, I'm sure you have your own stories. I know at least a dozen people that in the Athens area try to continue their lease only to find out that the rent was suddenly doubling or tripling, and they were basically being kicked out of the house. If you're a family and your kid is going to a local school, that can change that child's entire life. So rent stabilization is definitely something we need to look at.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about ownership versus renting generally.
Yeah. So this discussion we're having here about affordable housing, a lot of times people have it purely in a discussion of can people afford shelter? And that's the first priority. But I don't want to go so far as to ignore the value of home ownership. We want to see an increasing number of people make it into the so-called middle class. As we keep describing, African Americans in our community have just been blocked from access to the middle class. It's why there is no African American functional middle class in Athens. There are African American middle class members, but if you look at the ratios compared to what we would expect, they've been suppressed. And so one of the only ways to create wealth in America, the way wealth in America is created, is through home ownership. Now, to my progressive friends that are watching this, let me say this. I don't mean to put the idea of wealth creation as the most important idea in life. It is not the most important idea in life. But it would also be privileged for those of us, many activists like myself, white males, which are a lot of the activists in the progressive world, to say, well, we don't need wealth creation because white males already have access to an enormous amount of privilege when it comes to that. If we're ever going to see equity in terms of racial distribution of wealth, generational distribution of wealth, we have to increase home ownership. And to increase home ownership, we have to be deliberate. I know the Athens area Housing Authority has a specific section on their website about affordable home ownership. There's a number of programs. We don't necessarily have to create new programs, but we do have to increase awareness of these programs. And I see we got another David comment here.
Hey, welcome back, David. Thank you so much for another comment. David says another strategy is crowdfunding. Athens is a population of 100,000 people. If 100,000 people invest $100 to create a housing fund, That's $10 million. $10 million that can leverage $100 million at a 10-to-1 ratio. That's a whole lot of affordable that can be created to balance the current dynamics of real estate in Athens. Like I said, many more strategies that could be implemented.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
So David, that's a great idea and one
Yeah.
we'll look into. This is as good a time as any if you're just tuning in for us to emphasize this is only the start of the conversation. If you're interested or you have ideas like David's, David, we hope you'll join us. February 11th, we are having a potluck dinner. Our campaign does potlucks once a month that is open to the public. This one is going to have a theme. It's going to be about affordable housing. So please come. We're going to share the link on our Facebook page in about a week. Please come. Please join us. And please not only bring your favorite dish, but also bring some ideas like David's here. That'll be the second wave of this discussion as we're developing our affordable housing platform. I know we only have a one or two issues to address left. What do you want to target next, Mariah?
So let's talk a little bit about tax incentives by employers.
Yeah. The DC area. Let's talk about the DC area for a second. Downtown DC, in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination, there was a large riot, and that riot resulted in millions and millions and millions of dollars of property damage and destruction. What that did is it effectively scared people out of the center of downtown DC, and downtown DC became basically governed by slumlords and became a very unsafe area. One of the ways that this was turned around was by then Mayor Barry, and yes, this is the same Mayor Barry that later on went to have other scandals, but one of his signature accomplishments was basically bringing people back into downtown DC. One of the ways that he did this was by increasing incentives or regulations for city employees. There's a high percentage of our local city employees that do not live in our city. If you're one of them and you're watching this, I'm not coming for you. We're not coming for you. We understand all of the reasons why that might be the case. But we need to look at incentives that can bring an increasing number of those dollars and those employees back into our area and into affordable units into our area. One of the things we can do that is by offering incentives to individuals that do purchase or rent homes in this area. We also can work to create incentives, including tax-based incentives, for employers that have a certain percentage of their employees living in the Athens area or in certain areas. This is a strategy that's been used to great effect throughout the country. It's something that we could look at here. I know tax incentives sound like a dirty word, and they've been highly criticized because they're not always used effectively. But if we're careful and we're not just throwing money around, if we actually look at the numbers and make sure they line up, this could be an effective strategy to actually increase the number of people living in affordable units in the Athens area.
Indeed. Thank you, Tommy. And let's now turn to Vicki Allen has dropped a comment for us. As some clarification, if we're talking about student housing versus family housing.
Yeah, so we're talking about both, Vicki, but I appreciate you making that distinction. When we talk about 40% poverty in Athens, a lot of times naysayers on that topic who try to convince people that it's not a problem jump right into the idea that a high percentage of those people that are living in poverty are students. As if, I guess, buying into this stereotype of the wealthy college student. And it is true that Athens has a higher, college students in Athens are wealthier than in almost any other place. But there are also a lot of people that are trying to use education as economic transition. And I know that students in Athens are often living in actual, genuine poverty on top of the student loans that they're taking on. That has effects when it comes to housing. A lot of students live in substandard housing, and it's somewhat of a sticky problem because the student's presence depresses the number of housing units available. It depresses the access to affordable wages because they're willing to work for very little. But I think that we also have to look at housing overall. So if you're a student, I want you to have access to affordable housing. If you're a student that's coming from an economically disadvantaged background, then I especially want you to have access to programs that will allow you to access affordable housing. Because I would never want to live in a city where people choose to be educated elsewhere because they can't afford housing here, which is currently the case. Yeah. Yes, family housing is a big concern, and I think that addressing the needs of working families is the top priority of our campaign. Is how do we help protect people like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you very much, Vicky, for that comment.
Appreciate it.
So we've talked about a lot of different things so far, and just to re-emphasize Tommy's point, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We would love to see you all at our potluck and affordable housing discussion on February 11th, so that we can continue this conversation. But Tommy, what would you say were the main points to take away from the chat we've had today?
Well, before we go to summarize that, there's one last idea that I just want to bring up, which is Granny Flats. It's one last thing, not the best name, but what Granny Flats are is that they're basically separate units from the main house that may have access to limited utilities in themselves, but they're single units. They usually have a separate entrance. They might have access to shared or non-shared toilets and kitchenette. These types of units are not commonly used in the area, but a lot of other municipalities have basically increased access to permits for these. Portland, Oregon's a good example that managed to use Granny Flats. This all goes back to our initial discussion, the first point we talked about, which is co-living. We want to create more arrangements so that the variety of housing and family situations in Athens can be addressed through affordable housing. So Granny Flats, look it up, something that we'd like to talk about. So to summarize, Mariah, I'm going to put this on you for a second. Okay. So if you're a viewer at home right now, what are some of the major takeaways that you're going to go home with?
I think understanding how redlining has worked and how reverse redlining can undo that situation might be a big takeaway. David's comments on crowdfunding and what we can do to create land trusts in Athens is another key takeaway. Thinking about space efficiency, single family versus co-living, and what sorts of problems that can create and what solutions we can create around those issues might be ones that would resonate with me.
So I think those are all key takeaways. You may have your own, and just like you may have issues that you feel like we haven't addressed. So the big summary is this for me. Athens is the poorest college town in America. We don't say that with pride, but we say that because we want it to go away. We're addressing a problem. One of the remedies to that problem, especially when you look at the way that it adversely affects communities of color, African Americans, people that have been denied access to the middle class, it all comes down to housing. Our campaign is about opportunity and justice for all, and that part of that opportunity is, in order to have justice, everyone has to have the opportunity and access to affordable housing. We have to have the opportunity to find and secure affordable housing that's safe, and that can allow you and your family the ability to set up a good future. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation about affordable housing and getting more into the nuts and bolts about policies we might propose in the coming weeks, we ask you to do a couple things. One, if you're not already, please like our Facebook page. So you can just search Tommy Valentine for County Commissioner or click the link attached to this video and like our page. You can also follow us on Twitter at Tommy4, that's spelled out, F-O-R, Athens, Tommy for Athens. You also can join us at our potluck. When's potluck?
February 11th.
February 11th, and you can bring your favorite dish, and you can have a fun discussion with us and a productive discussion about affordable housing. And then finally, we are going to have an in-person meeting that you can join us, and that we hope we can bring the community in and really reinforce this discussion. So thanks for everyone for listening and for taking part. Thank you to Charlie for jumping in. Please share this video. You can click share and share it on your personal page. You include a personal statement with hashtag #AffordableAthens. Thanks, Mariah. Thanks, Ruth, for off camera for holding it down. Mariah, you want to send us home?
Thank you all so much for being here. This is just the beginning. And through continued conversations like these, we're going to change Athens.
That's right. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a great day.